The night 50 well-dressed strangers started screaming at a locked gate, while television cameras captured every second. I realized how quickly a person's carefully built empire can collapse when it's standing on land that was never theirs to begin with, and to understand why an expensive floating restaurant, a furious HOA president, and a simple chain across an old boat ramp all collided at once. You have to understand what that stretch of water meant to me long before money ever touched it. Because I'm Garrett Holloway, a retired engineer who believed my biggest challenge in life would be choosing the right hooks for a bait shop I planned to open in my late wife's honor, not dismantling a power-hungry HOA leader who thought tradition was an obstacle to be bulldozed. My family's story at this Montana lake started in 1952 when my grandfather bought 40 quiet acres with 300 feet of shoreline, land he chose not for profit but for peace. A place where the air smelled like pine and frost, where loons called across water so still it reflected the sky like glass, and where he built a wooden dock and a simple boat ramp with his own hands so neighbors could fish even if they didn't own shoreline themselves, because he believed access mattered more than ownership. And growing up I learned to fish there, listening to stories while coffee steamed in the morning chill, watching the seasons turn without anyone telling us we didn't belong. Later my wife Sarah turned that land into something even warmer by starting a small summer bass derby that grew into a tradition where mechanics, kids fished next to bankers, grandsons, where coolers were shared and nobody asked for membership cards. And after Sarah passed away I kept it going, because grief doesn't erase purpose, it sharpens it. I plan to open a small bait and tackle shop nearby, nothing fancy, just a place to keep her spirit alive. And that's how things were supposed to remain, simple, shared, respectful, until Vivian Blackstone arrived from Seattle with a wardrobe that cost more than my truck, and the kind of confidence that only comes from believing rules exist for other people. She'd been in town barely a month before running for HOA president, promising modernization and sophistication, words that sounded harmless until they started translating into bans on shoreline fishing because it didn't fit an aesthetic. Complaints about undesirables on the water, and eventually a glossy presentation at a March meeting where she unveiled plans for a floating restaurant designed to bring exclusivity and economic vitality to what she called underused space, the same space where children learned to cast and widows scattered ashes. And when I mentioned calmly that the only functional boat ramp sat on my private land under a deed older than the HOA itself, she smiled the way people do when dismissing an inconvenience, telling me progress required sacrifice, and I knew then she didn't see community, she saw opportunity. Construction began before dawn with diesel fumes replacing birdsong, heavy equipment tearing into water that had stayed clear for generations, runoff clouding areas where my grandchildren swam. And when I complained, I learned permits had somehow materialized overnight, which set off alarms in my engineer's mind. So I spent days digging through public records until I found what she'd skipped: the environmental approvals required for commercial structures on natural waterways. One anonymous phone call later, inspectors shut the project down temporarily, and the silence that followed felt like justice breathing again. But Vivian wasn't finished. She stormed onto my property accusing me of sabotage, filed false harassment reports, fined me through the HOA, and claimed my ramp had magically become community property through legal jargon she clearly didn't understand, which pushed me to walk my boundaries at dawn and discover someone had been digging around my survey markers. Proof she wasn't just bluffing, she was probing. Professional surveys confirmed what my grandfather had always known: the ramp was ours entirely, and when I posted legal notices, she tore them down and escalated to anonymous calls questioning my mental fitness. That was when I stopped thinking of her as an annoyance and started seeing her as a threat, the kind that smiles while stealing. The real turning point came when she installed an electronic gate on my ramp, charging locals to launch boats, watching a child cry because his grandfather's card wouldn't work, listening to an elderly woman sob because she couldn't scatter her husband's ashes without paying a fee. Those sounds carry, they cut deeper than shouting ever could. And late one night, with my grandfather's deed spread across the table, I noticed something I'd overlooked for decades: riparian rights, ownership not just of shoreline, but of the lakebed itself for 50 feet. and suddenly her floating restaurant wasn't just using my ramp. It was anchored partly on land, beneath the water that belonged to my family. Meanwhile, I uncovered the financial truth she'd been hiding. A massive loan taken out using HOA property as collateral without member approval. A gamble so reckless it risked the pool, clubhouse and courts families had paid for over years, all to prop up a restaurant that couldn't survive a Montana winter. Desperation dressed as ambition, and once you see that, the solution becomes simple. I didn't need to shout, I didn't need to threaten, I needed to enforce boundaries, literally, so I installed a commercial-grade hydraulic gate, legally, professionally, quietly, and activated it right as her biggest dinner crowd arrived. Watching confusion spread as luxury cars stopped cold, reservations evaporated, and Vivian herself appeared screaming that I was destroying her business. And for the first time the truth was visible to everyone, because without my ramp her operation was nothing but a floating illusion. She tried cutting wires, bribing neighbors, weaponizing social services, even ramming the gate in the dark, each move more frantic than the last. While employees quit over bounced paychecks and banks started asking questions, the community, once divided by fear and confusion, united through shared anger and shared history. Documents circulated, reporters sniffed around, and at a packed town meeting her story finally unraveled in public as evidence of fraud, bribery attempts, property violations, and financial deception piled up until police stepped forward and put handcuffs on the woman who once told us we couldn't stop progress. The applause that followed wasn't about revenge, it was relief. The gate came down the next morning, families returned to the water, laughter replaced shouting, and the restaurant was towed away like a bad idea whose time had run out. Vivian went to prison, the HOA dissolved, and the lake became quiet again, the kind of quiet that carries meaning. The kind where you hear loons instead of engines and children instead of cash registers. Sarah's Bass Derby returned bigger than ever, the bait shop opened its doors, and whenever I sit on the dock at dawn, I think about how close we came to losing something irreplaceable, not to force, but to paperwork and arrogance, which makes me wonder how many other places are one unchecked signature away from becoming private memories with price tags attached. And if you were standing where I stood, watching someone turn your family's legacy into a line item, would you have chained the gate, or would you have let them charge admission to your past?